Hi, this is Mr. Seymour, and this is the lecture for Chapter 2 on the founding and implementation, ratification of the Constitution. This is the most critical chapter that you're going to go through as far as your reading and the materials that the author presents to you, because it becomes the foundation for our understanding of the rest of American government. So everything we need will be outlined within the Constitution, and that will be the focus of this class. Our questions, our discussions, all should be within the frame of the Constitution. So let's go on ahead and get started with our discussion here of Chapter 2. And I wish you a really good week. So we'll see you in just a little bit at the end of the lecture. Chapter 2 in your textbook is titled Constitution and its Founding. So let's start with the preliminary parts to the Constitution, the events that lead up to our pursuit of a constitutional form of government. This is a picture from a recent Tea Party how can I put this? From a recent Tea Party demonstration. Look at some of the signs, and you will see that these are regular, average, ordinary people who truly believe, and rightfully so, that they are exercising their constitutional right to tell the government who's in charge. And it is the Constitution that lays out the fact that they have every right and responsibility to get together and let the government know when we as a group, any group, does not believe that the principles of equality and constitutionalism and republicanism are being followed. Because we, the people, are in charge of our Constitution. We are in charge of our government. Why is it that we needed a Constitution? Well, if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, it says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. That means something must have been wrong to begin with. And in order to understand what was going on, you have to go back to 1774 with the founding of the First Continental Congress in September 1774, which then becomes the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775. And you have two groups of people. Some people, especially from the southern states, want to have a lot of authority that the states should be given over the government, and should limit the authority of any kind of a federal government, because we had a unitary form of government under Great Britain, and they didn't want to see that. They didn't want any group or person to have total control over the people. They wanted people to have control over the government. So in 1776, Thomas Paine publishes a very famous pamphlet called Common Sense that makes a logical argument for why America should separate from the mother country, Great Britain. By 1775, we are already fighting the Revolutionary War in April 1775. So when we get to 1776, a lot of people don't realize that we are already committed to the separation from Great Britain. In July of 1776, Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, which should not be confused with the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, I like to call a love letter to King George and to Great Britain, to say, adios, we are no longer going to follow you. It is a way of telling Great Britain the reasons why we want to determine our own fate. and to have independence from the mother country. Yet at the same time, many Americans, most Americans, felt that they were still British. So this was a very difficult time in American history. In 1777, November 1777, the Articles of Confederation will be adopted by Congress, and that will become the predecessor to our Constitution. But it's a document that gives a lot of authority to the states and not very much authority to any central government. And that's very important to understand. That's where the more perfect union comes in. Because by 1780s, when they're ratified, 1781, we have an issue dealing with states' rights versus federal authority. So by 1781, March of 1781, we do adopt as a nation the Articles of Confederation. And again, the problem with them is that it gives a lot of power to the states and not very much power to any kind of a federal government because we don't trust centralized government. But we quickly come to a realization as time goes on that there is a role for a federal government. We are not yet a United States. By October of 1781, Cornwallis will surrender to the British. The British Army will surrender under Cornwallis to the American Army under George Washington, and we become what we know as the United States. But we're not united yet, and we won't be until 1789. By 1786, it's very clear that the articles aren't working. Something's happened by August of 1786, and in September, everybody gets together and says, ooh, we've got a problem. And that something that happened was called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a group of farmers who were rising up against the authority of the state to take their property away if they couldn't pay their bills. And they wanted their property protected. So what it ended up with is a series of rebellious riots that threatened to tear apart the country. When these events start happening, the delegates that went in September of 1786, who were there to discuss fixing the Articles of Confederation, realized that there was no fixing the Articles of Confederation and that we did indeed need a more perfect union. So they agreed to reconvene in Philadelphia, even though they did not have their legislature's approval of it from any of the states. They agreed on their own. And they met in May of 1787 to form a constitutional convention. Now, once that convention is convened in May of 1787, by September, we have a drafted and signed document from the Founding Fathers. Now all we have to do is get the states to approve. And remember, the problem was that the states weren't really ready to approve a document that was going to give a lot of authority to a central government and somehow limit their authority. At least that's the way they saw it. So by October of 1787, James Madison, James Monroe, and a series of other authors start to publish papers in newspapers in New York and other places around the country that basically outlined their thoughts and their intent as they developed this new form of government called a federal republic. And these Federalist papers are there to promote the idea that a central government and the state governments can coexist, and we call that principle federalism. By June of 1788, the ninth state ratifies the Constitution. The remaining states will ratify the Constitution after that point. And in March of 1789, the Constitution takes effect. We tend to celebrate September 17th as Constitution Day, and that week as Constitution Week, because that's when it was signed. But it wasn't for almost 2 more years, at least 18 more months, that we still are under the Articles of Confederation. Even though it's signed in 1787, it's not ratified completely and put into place until March of 1789. So what were the political ideals and goals of the Founding Fathers? They wanted to create a document, this Constitution, that was general in nature. It's a very brief document. And remember, it's only been changed 27 times, and 10 of those were to create the Bill of Rights. So, and one of them was to undo a mistake. So when you look at it, we haven't changed it formally very much. And I like to say that our Constitution is a living document. That's an argument that we make a lot. But more importantly, it acts kind of like a mannequin in a clothing store. As times change, the mannequin doesn't have to change. You don't have to replace the mannequin. You can take a mannequin from the 40s and dress it up with contemporary clothing and make it look just as hip as any other mannequin would be in any store. Because it's the clothing that changes with the times. The structure of the mannequin doesn't change. And that's what we see in our Constitution. That's why it is the oldest written Constitution still in use today. But we've left a lot open to interpretation with the intent that as times change, we would apply the Constitution according to the times. And we tend to do that. That's what makes it a living document. So what are some of the concepts? Well, first you have the concept of republicanism. And republicanism is the belief that a form of government should be instituted where the interests of the people are represented through our elected leaders. And that this would be the best form of government because it mixes Aristotle's idea of an elite government with an aristocracy, with a democracy that allows the people to choose their leaders. We are not, though, involved in every decision because once we elect the leaders, they make the decisions for us. Whether we agree or disagree, that becomes a different issue. The concept of the consent of the governed is a guiding principle throughout the Constitution, and particularly the fact that the 3 big, bold words at the front of the Constitution's preamble, we the people of the United States, they are there to show the rest of the world who's in charge of our government. The people are. So the consent of the governed, or popular sovereignty, is the idea that a government gains its legitimacy through the holding of regular elections, fair and regular elections, and that the people living under such a government participate by electing their leaders, and then the leaders are somehow granted the ability to make decisions for them. Along with that comes John Locke's social contract, where men, in his mind, are born with natural rights, that among those natural rights are life, liberty, and property. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson, in writing the Declaration of Independence, took some liberties and changed the life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders believed that the upholding of the rights of life, liberty, and property should be the government's central purpose. To provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty. Those are the purposes of our government. Where do we find them? In the preamble to the Constitution. the idea of human nature and its implications for democracy. There are two forms or ideas of the social contract. On one side, we have Locke, who says people are good by nature, should be trusted, and are able to rule themselves. But there's another man who came along about 80 years or so before Locke, who he came from the era of the British or the English Revolution, where he saw men fighting against men, brother against brother, and he said that humans by their nature and life by its nature is short, brutish, and full of misery. He was a real optimist. He believed that people can't be trusted and that the purpose of government is to protect people from themselves. So Locke believes that the purpose of government is to protect and secure the blessings that people have of their natural rights. And Thomas Hobbes believes that the purpose of government is to protect people from hurting each other. The framers were very astute and reticent to the fact that humans are by their nature self-interested, and that governments have to productively channel the greedy nature of human behavior. So this is where the debate over factions comes in, and it takes up a great deal, particularly in Federalist 10, takes up a great deal of debate. The idea that governments have to be able to handle any faction or group that tends to take over the majority. And James Madison called it the tyranny of the majority. He said, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by a common interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregated interests of the community. That's what he called a faction. We call them today political parties and special interests, and they pretty much run government. And it's how we acknowledge them and limit them that makes our government special. It is the fact that we not only recognize the human greed, but we celebrate our greediness by allowing us to compete with each other in these factions. We actually make an opportunity for competition amongst factions so that there's a voice for everyone. We call it polity or politics. And it is the way in which we come from conflict to compromise, as the author of your textbook would argue. Here's another statement that Madison made. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. He went on to say that in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, that the greatest difficulty lies in the fact that you have to enable the government to control the governed, yet give the governed enough right and power to oversee their government. So he says, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So how can we trust government to control itself? It all depends on the relationship between the people and the governed and the government. A dependence, then, has to be placed on the people to take primary control over the government. But, he says, experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, meaning we need to put in a set of firewalls, to use modern vocabulary, things that separate the people and their government and the people from each other. This is the magic of constitutionalism. So factions are groups of like-minded people who are trying to influence the government to do something. We would call them special interests, or if they're trying to get someone elected, we call them political parties. And they often try to dominate the government. So the only way to answer a faction is with allowing other factions. American government is designed to avoid the domination of any one faction over the government by allowing multiple factions to exist. Why must factions exist? Well, because we all have differences of opinion, and as individuals we feel like we can't really get our voice heard unless we make it loud enough, and the way we make it loud enough is by grouping together. So, do people make mistakes? Yes. Are governments governed by people? Yes. Are there differences in wealth, property, native ability, education? Yes. Will there always be poor and rich? Yes. Will there always be those who have and do not have property? Yes. And we have to somehow give everybody a voice in their government. And if we don't, if we give any one group power over the others, then we have a tyranny, not a democracy. So he sees two ways, Madison, to eliminate what he called the deleterious effects of factions. But he says only one of those ways will work, because liberty is to faction as air is to fire. When we allow people to be free, they want to exercise their freedoms. So one solution is to get rid of liberty. Well, if you get rid of liberty and you restrain liberties and individual liberties, then you do have a tyranny. The second way was to control factions by saying if you can't beat them, join them. So if you make sure that there are enough of them and that no one faction is going to grow so powerful that it overshadows the others, then you could say, hey, we reach a point of compromise out of conflict. So he goes on in Federalist Paper number 51 to say that in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then you have to oblige it to control itself. We looked at this a little earlier. The framers are trying very hard to reach that difficult point at which we balance factions and majority rule and self-government and protections all together. And somehow we've done it. And that's the miracle of our document that we call the Constitution. One of the things he said was you have to have majority rule, but you also have to recognize the rights of minorities. So we balance majority rule, the democracy side, with minority rights. We also have to understand that the Founding Fathers had greed-based motivations as well, because they all had economic interests and they all were property holders. And they were all educated. So the idea of a republic sounded good to them because they felt like they were the ones qualified to be the elected leaders, and then the people would somehow approve them to be in government. So they saw this as a way of giving themselves power as well. So we can't take that part out of the equation. Charles Baird argued that the framers established the Constitution to protect their property rights. The problems with the argument is that both the advocates and the opponents of the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, both came from the upper class. It's just that the Anti-Federalists were so worried about their property that they believed the Federalists, the elitists, wanted to control their property, and they wanted to control it themselves. So another expert, David Robertson, said that the delegates who made the Constitution were first and foremost politicians. They weren't philosophers, they weren't real estate investors, they were politicians, but they all had property. So understanding that there is an economic context to the Constitution is incredibly critical. The United States had a lot of land and had a lot of landowners, and unlike Europe, we had no tradition of feudalism. So there was relative economic equality in comparison to Europe. The South was agrarian, agriculturally based, and supported free trade because they wanted to get their goods to market. Particularly, they wanted to get eventually their cotton traded with Great Britain, and they wanted to be able to get their tobacco. And the North was a manufacturing-based economy that wanted protective tariffs that would allow their infant industries to compete with European industries, especially during the early 1800s in what we call the Industrial Revolution. So we look at how compromise is achieved through the political process, and we can look just to the Constitutional Convention. The discussion of majority rule and minority rights, the rights of large versus small states, the idea of legislative versus executive power, the conflict of national power versus state power versus local power, and let us not forget the issue of slavery, slave states versus non-slave states. We had to reach a series of compromises to be able to address these disagreements between large states and small states, northern states and southern states. So let's look at the conflict between the smaller states and the larger states. There were three plans, or two actually. One was the Virginia Plan, which favored large states. It proposed that representation would be based solely on population. The second was the New Jersey Plan, which was favored by small states, that said every state should get an equal vote. Well, that would benefit the smaller states, but it would put the larger states to a disproportionate disadvantage. So a new compromise had to be reached, the Connecticut Plan, which becomes what we call the Great Compromise. And that says, you know what? Let's have a two-house or bicameral form of government, and let's select our legislators, our lawmakers in the House of Representatives on the basis of population, and they will represent the interests of the citizens, the people. We will have an upper house that is based and designed to represent the interests of the states. And each state gets the same number of representatives in the upper house, senators, and then we give the representatives or congressmen to the states on the basis of their population. Every 10 years we conduct a census. And that is the Great Compromise, and that is the bicameral system of government that we have today. Then we have the issue of legislative versus executive power. Do we give all of the authority to the president and make him into a king or a tyrant, or do we give all the authority to the legislative branch and give the executive no power? And the Federalists wanted strong executive power, but they also realized that it was going to have to be balanced. Because they said that legislatures were too slow and too unwieldy, and that they favored energy in the executive, so that a leader with strong prerogative powers, the ability to get things done first and ask questions later, and ask permission later, could do the business of the people in the case of a crisis. So that we still have that concept. The president commits the troops, then he goes back 60 or 90 days later and asks for permission. Anti-Federalists said this is giving the president or the executive a blank check. So Madison comes up with a compromise, the separation of powers, and he says all of the powers of the president, all the powers of the judiciary, all of the powers of the executive branch, all of the powers of the legislature itself and the Senate, they all have to be balanced and separated through a separation of powers and a system of checks and balances. The compromise that we get is, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but when you vote every 4 years to elect a president, you're not voting to elect the president, you're voting on the electors that your state will select. Most states have what is called a winner-take-all system of selecting their electors to the Electoral College between the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. In Texas, that tends to go to the Republican Party. Does that mean Democrats have no say at all? Well, yes and no. And this is an area that is subject to a lot of debate and criticism today. Is the Electoral College valid? Well, there's a reason for it, and that is that, remember, we have to have some way of protecting the people from themselves, and the belief was that people could be swayed to follow a charismatic leader, and by doing so, if they voted directly for president, would not make an informed decision. So the most informed decision would come from the elite aristocracy that we elect, called representatives, the representatives in each of the states. The parliamentary system that Great Britain used was a system of government where the legislative and the executive power are joined together, and that the legislator selects one of their own to be the chief executive or prime minister. The prime minister forms a cabinet from the members of the parliament, and they're all from the same party, whichever party gets the most votes. This is a very strong contrast to our system, where we allow for party differences, and we allow for differences of opinion, and we allow a variety of people to get involved because we do it through election. And we give a lot of power, strong power, to the executive, and we weaken the power of the legislative a little bit. So now we get to national versus state power. And this is a fight we've been doing for over 200 years. We fought civil war over this issue. So let's start with the balancing act that we call federalism. Federalism is the American system where we divide power between levels of government that have specific powers and can control different areas of policy. When we look at government arguments and disputes, a lot of it comes down to state power, local power, and national power. And apportionment, how we select our legislators, whether or not a state should be allowed on its own to have slavery, a state's regulation of commerce versus the national regulation of commerce, who gets the right to tax, how was the Constitution amended. All of these things involve this balancing act of federalism. And we're going to spend a whole chapter on it in a little bit, but we're going to look at right now at two key parts. First, we want to look at the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 6, Section 2. It says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that national laws take precedent over state laws if the two conflict with each other. A compromise was reached with the Anti-Federalists within the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that protect individual rights and liberties. This is where Amendment 9 and Amendment 10 come in. The 10th Amendment is the key to federalism, and it is the key to states' rights, because it says that all the powers that are not specifically given to the federal government belong to the states and to the people. So this is where we start to see limitations that are placed on government. Then we get to the issue of slavery, slave states and non-slave states. Slavery probably created the most contentious arguments at the Constitutional Convention. Should there be limitations on the importation, breeding, possession, sale, exchange of slaves? How do you deal with a runaway slave? Especially if a runaway slave or a slave is taken to a non-slave state, does that slave automatically have the rights not to be a slave? And how would slaves be counted for the purpose of representation? This issue shows the limitations and the drawbacks of the political process with regard to negotiation and compromise. And some tough compromises were reached. The inclusion of slavery in the Constitution and the fact that the Constitution specifically forbids the discussion and the outlaw of slavery for the first 20 years of our nation's existence is a good example of how sometimes good compromise can turn bad. It puts the nation on course for what would later be called the Civil War. But the question is, was it the right thing to do if that's what it took to get the Constitution ratified? I guess in the case of a lot of the northern states, they felt like they were making a deal with the devil, because most of the northern states opposed slavery. They didn't need slavery because they were dependent upon industry. However, the southern states were highly dependent upon slavery because they were agrarian and needed slave labor. The compromises that were reached to keep the African slave trade going for another, well, the slave trade in the United States will end in the early 1800s, in the 1820s, but the importation. But the trade from one person to another of slaves already here or born here continues up until the 1860s. They illustrate, though, how negotiation works. The first thing we have is the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise was where the southern states wanted to count their slaves as a full person, and the northern states didn't want to count them at all, so they came to an agreement that they'd count for 3/5 of a person. 3/5 of a person. So a slave counted 3/5 of a person. It's an example of splitting the difference, or some would argue, going back to examples from the Bible, splitting the baby. Look up Saul. This is an example of what's called a log roll, or a vote trade. The northern states agreed to it in exchange for the southern states approving Congress's right to tax. Also, the northern states gave in on the idea that a runaway slave or a slave taken to a free state was still property and had to be returned to the owner, and it is in the original Constitution. And it will actually come up in the 1820s as an issue with the Supreme Court. And this is where you get the Dred Scott decision that says a slave is property. So this chart, which is in your textbook, shows the ratification process and all of the compromises that were made. So with regard to apportionment, larger states wanted population, smaller states wanted an equal number of representatives per state, and we came up with the great compromise that created the Senate and the House, bicameral Congress. The method of electing, the larger states wanted the people to do it. The smaller states wanted the states to do it. And we came up with the House being elected or selected by the people on the basis of population, and the state legislatures selecting senators, which we now have changed to direct election from the people as well. Then, president. The larger states wanted Congress to select the president. The smaller states wanted the states to select the president, and we came up with a compromise that we call the Electoral College, which gives you and I a say in who is our executive. Then, who decides federal and state conflicts? The larger states wanted federal authority. Smaller states wanted the state courts to have the authority. And the compromise was to give more credence to the state courts. And then eventually the federal courts now have a lot of power over this. Control over commerce with regard to slaves. The position of the larger states was that the states should do it. The position of the smaller states was that Congress should do it. And the compromise was that Congress will will have control over commerce, but a 20-year exemption for the importation of slaves was granted before it could even be decided that slaves could not be imported into the United States. The larger states wanted to count slaves one-to-one like citizens. The smaller states didn't want to count them at all, and what you had was a 3/5 compromise where each slave is considered 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation, even though they weren't really being represented. And then you have individual rights. The slave states said, we want the state constitution to deal with individual rights, and we don't need a national bill of rights. The non-slave states wanted a national bill of rights to be applied across the board. And what you got was a Bill of Rights passed by the first Congress that is ratified by all of the states in 1791. We call that the first 10 amendments. We call it the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So then we have Federalist and Anti-Federalist claims and how they would counter each other. The Federalists tried to counter the claims of Anti-Federalists by claiming that the name Federalist was an important rhetorical move. They published a series of newspaper articles called the Federalist Papers, and they provided in those Federalist Papers justification for why they believed we needed a constitution. Most importantly, they promised to pass a Bill of Rights that would placate the Anti-Federalists who believed that individual rights needed to be protected. And that's how we get the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So let's look at a federal system and how the powers are delegated. The powers that are delegated to the national government include levying tariffs and taxes, regulating interstate and foreign trade, coining money, maintaining armed forces, declaring war, establishing the post office, and establishing courts. The powers that we give to the states in the Constitution are to tax citizens, to control education, to punish criminals, to protect public health and safety, to conduct elections, to establish local governments, and to regulate marriage law. That's how the states and the courts have interpreted it. Now we have our concurrent powers, and those are the things that are shared by both the state and the national government, and those are to maintain law and order, to levy taxes, to borrow money, to take land for public use, as long as you remunerate the person that you took the land from equitably, and to provide for public welfare. Those are state and national rights and obligations. These are our exclusive powers. The constitutional framework has survived for over 220 years, even though it has some flaws. But some powers are given specifically to each branch. The congressional powers are the right to the power to raise money via taxation, to coin money, to regulate commerce, to establish roads, patents, and copyrights, to declare war, to have the power of the purse, and this is the part that gives the federal government a little more power than the states, to do whatever is necessary and proper, and to make any laws necessary and proper to implement those powers that they already have. We call this the elastic clause, and it gives Congress the ability to stretch its powers, to put it bluntly, like a small pair of underwear on a very large man. So, separation of powers. We give powers to Congress, we give powers to the executive, and we give powers to the judicial branch. The congressional powers include the power to raise revenue with taxation and borrowing, to regulate commerce, to coin money, to establish roads, patents, and copyrights, to declare war, to control the purse, the necessary proper clause, and to interpret the Constitution when it comes to the scope of conflict between state and congressional powers. The Supreme Court has the most power. The executive powers are all vested in the office of the president, and this is a phrase that presidents have argued about, saying that they have executive privilege. The president serves as commander-in-chief. He ensures that the laws are faithfully executed, and he oversees the bureaucracy through 15 cabinet-level executive departments that he nominates leaders of and that are approved or ratified by Congress, the Senate. Now, a big point of debate, and something you can look up right now, President Obama is being sued by Congress saying that he has overstepped his executive powers. Is there such a thing? This becomes an interesting question. Now let's look at judicial powers. They consist of the United States Supreme Court and the lower federal courts. The primary function of the courts is to hear cases that challenge legislation or require interpretation of the law. The United States Supreme Court has 9 justices. Those justices are chosen by the president. They are confirmed by the Senate. They have a lifetime appointment, so they serve for life. Now in the states, they don't. And this is a power they gave to themselves, the power of judicial review, which is the power of the court to overturn the law on the basis of its constitutionality. And this is where the judicial branch has given itself a little more power than what the founding fathers had originally intended. Shared powers. No one branch of government has exclusive control. Presidents can make treaties, they can nominate judges, but both of those have to have the advice and consent of the Senate. Congress has the power to declare war, and those powers were originally intended to be shared, but presidents have essentially taken that power away, and now we've had to limit them through the War Powers Act that we'll look at much later in the course. Then we have our negative or check powers. A president, for instance, can say no to Congress. Congress can say no to the president again by overriding his veto. The president can be impeached, but then again, so can judges. And the impeachment does not remove the president. It's kind of like him being charged with something. And then the Senate actually does the removal after they've convicted. And it's never been done where the Senate convicted. The impeachment has been done twice. Congress controls the money, even if the executive branch is able to take the power in other ways. And the judicial review, the principal judicial review, allows the Supreme Court to determine whether a law is constitutional or not, and it's a power that it gives to itself, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So now we get to the question of the living document. Is the Constitution an example for all nations or an outdated document? Is it alive and well? Your authors argue that there are 4 reasons that the Constitution could be called a living document. First, we oftentimes see the courts turning a blind eye to certain things that might have been illegal or not authorized by law earlier on. I think then you get to maybe the interpretation of drug laws right now, marijuana. The executive is turning a blind eye, but is Congress turning a blind eye? Probably not. And certainly are the courts going to turn a blind eye? We'll see in the future. Ambiguity. Making a ruling so ambiguous that it's hard to implement. The changing Constitution, actually going in and formally amending the Constitution, and then allowing for multiple interpretations of the courts. This is how we can see the examples of the Constitution being a living document today. So then we need to look at the process by which we actually do change the Constitution. Now, the first process is the proposal. Congress proposes an amendment by at least a 2/3 vote, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures can then ratify, and that's been done all but one time. The second is that Congress can propose an amendment by at least a 2/3 vote, and then 3/4 of the states call a convention for the purpose of ratifying the amendment, and that has been done once. Once the amendment is proposed by a national convention is when we believe that something needs to be done, but Congress won't do it, so we do it ourselves, the states or the people. And so an amendment is proposed by a national convention that is called by at least 2/3 of the state legislatures. Then if 3/4 of the state legislatures approve, you have a ratification, and now you have an amendment. It's never been done. The other way is that 3/4 of the state conventions, the people, again, take even precedent over the states, and they call state conventions for the purpose of ratifying. That's also never been done. So the proposal through the National Convention process has never been used, ever. Turning a blind eye. These are amendments that were introduced in Congress that didn't pass. 112th Congress, 2011 to 2012, they wanted to change the First Amendment to allow limitations on federal campaign contributions and expenditures, to protect the rights of parents to raise and educate their children without interference from government, and to require that the federal budget be balanced. Didn't happen. The 111th Congress proposed abolishing the Electoral College and providing for the direct election of the President and the Vice President, providing for a high-quality education to all citizens in the United States and making it a responsibility of the federal government, to repeal the 16th Amendment, which prohibits income taxes. It would be to prohibit an income tax, because the 16th Amendment authorizes the income tax. None of those have been authorized. The 110th Congress proposed repealing 22nd Amendment, abolishing term limits of the President, providing the right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment for all persons, to permit voluntary school prayer as an amendment to the Constitution, and to impose a 12-year term limit, which would mean roughly 2 terms as a senator or 6 terms as a representative. The 109th Congress said, let's make filibuster in the Senate a part of the Constitution so that we can never take filibuster away. Provide for the opportunity of government in the case of a catastrophic event, or the continuity of government. And provide discretion of the prohibit desecrating the United States flag, which, by the way, under the Constitution today is considered symbolic speech and is protected under the First Amendment, so you'd have to have an amendment that said you can't desecrate the flag. 108th Congress, 2003-2004, including the use of in the word God in the Pledge of Allegiance and the national motto as protected speech, defining marriage in all states as a union between a man and a woman, and to prohibit courts from protecting child pornography. These are all amendments that didn't pass. The use of ambiguity. The elastic clause allows for ambiguity because it says to Congress, hey, if you have another power, you can use the elastic clause to implement a law that implements that power. So, for instance, the Commerce Clause is used a lot. The Executive Powers Clause. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution states the executive power shall be vested in the President. This broad statement has been used to justify many presidents' assertions of power. And it's being used right now. And right now the president is being sued. So we'll see how that goes. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. The Supreme Court's interpretation has varied, but today it's used as the basis for a lot of Congress's legislation. In previous times, it was seen as a limit that prevented the ability of Congress to enact things like a child labor law, worker safety laws, minimum wage laws, maximum hour laws, all of which later on were passed. And then enumerated powers, the powers that are granted explicitly to Congress, the President or the Supreme Court in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. So the Congress's power to raise and support an army, the President's power as Commander-in-Chief, they conflict with each other. So let's look at checks and balances. We have to put a series of checks and balances against the 3 branches. So for instance, the President can veto a piece of legislation from Congress. But Congress, the Senate, has to approve a presidential nomination, and Congress can pass laws that override the President's veto. The President nominates the judges for life. The court has to interpret the actions of the President. The court has to interpret the laws that Congress passes, yet Congress, the Senate, has to confirm the President's nomination of a justice to the Supreme Court or a judge in the federal courts. Also, Congress can impeach and remove judges from office. It's rarely done. And with this, we also get to due process. The war on terror, checks and balances. So Congress passes the anti-torture law and holds hearings on that law. The Supreme Court says that the executive branch violated the rights of suspected terrorists, and so they overrode that. Under the Constitution, Congress alone has the power of the purse to fund a government program, but President Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq. The ongoing effort there depended on congressional authorization of funds to pay war. Here's the thing. Once the president commits the troops, who's going to say no to giving the troops the money to fund them and keep them operating? Nobody is going to say no. And that's where the president has that prerogative power to just send them in. Some people argue that the Constitution should not be used to make policy, except for broader purposes like expanding political rights or protecting equality. So the 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919, prohibited alcohol. And it's often upheld as an example of a failed policy attempt, which was then overridden. And so this is a 1933 photograph of a beer distributor who was getting out his first shipment following ratification of the 21st Amendment, which got rid of the 19th Amendment, or the 18th Amendment, pardon me. And that is the end of your textbook's discussion of the Constitution. As you can tell, it's rather vague, so be sure that you read more into detail, and also take a look at the Constitution. I'm going to have you do a few things as we go along in the course and talk to you about sections of the Constitution, so read it. You'll find it very enlightening. With that, have a really good day, and we'll see you in the next lecture.